Brazilian Jiu Jitsu is one of the most popular martial arts these days, but that wasn't always the case. Starting off as Kano's Jiu Jitsu, it evolved over the years. But what changed over the span of a century? And how is BJJ different today compared to when it was first developed? To find out, I asked Brazilian Jiu Jitsu expert Stephan Kesting to join me in watching 5 different BJJ videos, each from a different period, to see how BJJ evolved over the years, starting with this clip from 1912 of Kano's Jiu Jitsu, aka Judo, the root martial art of BJJ.
If we stop here, this is really interesting. Just as soon as he lies all the way back. If you look at the distance between his hips and the other guy's head, so it's like 1.5 feet of distance, this exact armbar might work at white belt in judo or Brazilian Jiu Jitsu competition. This particular armbar would never work at a higher level because there's too much room. And you see this a lot in systems that teach the armbar but don't spar the armbar. Either these guys are showing it wrong on purpose, or they've never trained it against any kind of live resistance. I mean, the founder of judo, Kano, didn't particularly like the groundwork. Very certainly biased his art towards the stand-up component. There were a bunch of people in the early Kodokan who did specialize in groundwork. These tended to be the fighters. Again, Americana, legitimate submission. In its core, it's the same technique. I would argue that in the last 30 years, knowledge of how to make this tighter, harder to escape, that has improved.
That reminds me of this argument that if BJJ would neglect rolling and sparring, years down the road probably would end up looking not necessarily like Aikido, but in that regard where it's like it's not realistic and you're like, I guess there's something behind it, but passed down from generation to generation without any pressure. You can see the technique somewhere deep down there, but it's just not practical. We then took a look at some old school footage of the most influential people in the birth of Brazilian Jiu Jitsu, the Gracie family.
Early Gracie Jiu Jitsu was very strongly influenced by judo. You can see it here. I mean, this is basically people going for foot sweeps, trying to do judo throws. The research that my friend Robert Drysdale has done suggests that there used to be much more even emphasis in jiu-jitsu between standing work and groundwork. This kind of rolling would not be out of place in academy today, because as soon as you add pressure to something, we're instinctively going to start doing very similar things to what these guys are doing. I would say that style of going for an armbar is a little bit old school. Most armbars from mount nowadays would be performed from the S mount just because it leaves less room. The real question is, when the Gracies were teaching in this era, how much sparring there was for the student as opposed to the family members. It seems like sparring at the end of the day among family members was a common thing, but if you came in to do the series of lessons, certainly the class format, it's common nowadays, 30 people and everyone rolls with everybody. That was unheard of in this day. It wasn't until Carlson and Hall's Gracie opened up their own academy that the modern jiu-jitsu class format was established.
Whoa, that's crazy. I never saw this before.
This is interesting. At the time, this was probably done like, what's the most spectacular thing that we can do? But variations of this technique done somewhat differently. The modern flying armbar is done somewhat differently, where you're going more underneath the guy. It's still dangerous. Strangely, it's not that unrealistic. Like, you see this, you go, that would never work. Then you go out and like, oh no, he pulled it off and he pulled it off. Just because it's fancy doesn't mean it doesn't work. I think at the time, Gracie Jiu Jitsu was also really being promoted as a system of health and longevity. That hence the Gracie diet, hence the Carlos Gracie Sr. doing some calisthenics.
Our next video was footage from late 1980s of Helson Gracie.
Well, certainly the video footage does look very late 80s. Let's see what the Jiu Jitsu looks like. Standing up is the most effective way to break a stubborn closed guard. And in this era, many schools really only taught the closed guard. I have friends who, when they started opening their guards to try and go to like butterfly guards, these old school schools in this era would get yelled at by the instructor.
Oh, wow.
Keep your guard closed. And now there's people who don't know one attack from closed guard. He's going for a basic pressure pass. Interestingly, not taught how the Gracie Academy, especially the Torrance Gracie Academy, taught it initially. They changed it to make it less vulnerable to the triangle. For a long time, the basic way to pass the guard that was taught was basically inviting people to do a triangle choke. And then the excuse would be, well, you got triangle choke, you didn't do every single step correctly. I would argue if a technique needs to be done perfectly for it to be successful, then I would argue there's something wrong with the technique. This method of passing the guard is a one-arm under smash pass. You still see this exact technique done on the mats today. It's funny because there's so much variability in the expression of jiu-jitsu that if you had decent jiu-jitsu from the 1970s or 1980s, it would still work on the mats today. It might not be as efficient. If you took the very best practitioner from the 1980s and brought him onto the mat today, stuck him into a world championship tournament, I doubt he would win, because there's stuff that's come up now, like in the case of the gi, like a lapel wrap around the leg in a 50-50 leg position. That's really hard to break, even if you know what it is. is. And if you don't know what it is, it's the first time that you've encountered it, good luck. Like, that's a lot of troubleshooting on the fly. So if you took somebody who was really good in the 80s, their stuff would work, but they would need answers to the new stuff.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems that's one of the ways sometimes people win championships, or maybe not as much anymore, but somebody would come in and they would discover some new efficient way and nobody knows what's coming. And so it's easier to get people with that new method. But then 2 years later, everybody does that. And then that does not win championships whatsoever anymore. But the new guy comes in with the new thing and then there goes the story again.
There was this magic, wonderful period where if you knew leg locks and the other guy didn't, you could tap them out. And it didn't matter if they were a Brazilian Jiu Jitsu black belt who'd won a bunch of championships. And then they would get mad and then they would kill you with something else. But, you know, a blue belt could tap out a black belt. And I think those days are now gone because it's just become so much part of the meta. I think with the dissemination of YouTube now, you're not going to be like black belt world champion hoping to win the next year's black belt world championship and develop an entirely new game. People are going to be watching you.
Next up, I pulled up some clips from early 2000s of Eddie Bravo, who brought in some changes to BJJ.
So this is an interesting submission. So the twister is a twisting spine lock. It's interesting for a couple of reasons. There are ancient Greek statues of people doing things that are quite similar to this, but different. You can say that this submission has existed for thousands of years, but certainly doing it with double triangle, or what the 10th Planet guys would call a lockdown on one of the legs to stop the lower body from rotating, that's a new innovation. While I might not agree with Eddie Bravo's politics or his interpretation of astrophysics, it's undeniable that the guy has contributed to jiu-jitsu. I don't think the rubber guard, which Eddie Bravo was known for, which he made work, I don't think that's really reached deep penetration or made big changes. You don't see many high-level guys doing it. It was supposed to revolutionize MMA, and it didn't. But his approach did have other contributions to the art. Okay, so this is interesting. This approach of getting one hook in, the low hook, or what he would call the twister hook, that did exist before. You see old school Sambo practitioners doing this. Catch wrestling and Sambo did have this in it, but in terms of popularizing it within the sport of jiu-jitsu, I have to give credit to Eddie Bravo for doing that.
And then we took a look at the biggest star of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu today, Gordon Ryan.
So this segment here, where he comes out, pulls butterfly guard, starts threatening an arm drag and working his way to the back, that is classic Marcelo Garcia, who was much smaller than Gordon Ryan, did a very successful run of 4 or 5 world championships, 4 or 5 Abu Dhabis, both in his division and in the open. Also one of the nicest human beings I've ever met. Gordon Ryan has taken much of his guard work and the basic attacks from the guard from Marcelo Garcia, with the addition of a detailed leg lock system. Marcelo Garcia did use leg locks, but I'll say Gordon Ryan's leg locks are more developed. When God was handing out empathy and being a decent human being, Gordon Ryan went back for a second dose of jiu-jitsu, and one of the things that he got was a very good leg lock system and has put in a tremendous amount of time. So what's interesting here is that especially in no-gi grappling, there's a couple of things that have come up in the last 10 years. One is that passing the guard on the feet is much, much more prevalent than passing the guard on the knees. Is this a temporary phase? Will guys figure out how to pass the guard on the knees again? I think so. This mixing of wrestling and jiu-jitsu is becoming much more common and is driven in part by the rule systems of Abu Dhabi and whatnot, where pulling guard is penalized. So people are becoming better wrestlers.
Is the evolution of jiu-jitsu visible to you through those videos?
If you just saw the jiu-jitsu, you could have a reasonably good chance of placing it in an era. That being said, it's a very diverse sport. Some people might be playing with a style that's 30 years old. It's super fascinating to watch the evolution in the arms race, and the example I gave of jiu-jitsu on the knees. People get good at defending on the knees. Now there's an advantage to passing standing up. Now people get good at defending that, and people figure out how to apply leg locks against that. People go back down to the knees. What people did in the past, kept pressure testing, still works today, but there's new stuff today that needs to be taken into account. It's so complicated to keep track of it all. You're never in your personal game going to be able to include it all. You do have to be kind of aware of what's going on, though, to at least defend it. I think we're already seeing the divergence of gi and no-gi jiu-jitsu. Pretty soon we'll see that just because you're the best no-gi guy, you're going to get slaughtered in the gi, and vice versa. There just isn't enough time in the day to train the two things. And then furthermore, there's going to be different systems. Training for EBI is very different from training from the Abu Dhabi rule set. You may see more and more specialization, and with specialization and restriction comes creativity. And MMA grappling is very different from jiu-jitsu grappling now, for the most part. So that's actually 3 disciplines that have diverged that all used to be one.